to the Red Chair. Today we have a very special guest, our dear friend Mike Butcher. Good to see you here in Lisbon again.
Great, thanks very much for having me.
I think we met like 10 years ago. You've been a big fan of Lisbon for over a decade. I mean,
yeah.
What brought you here in the first place?
Well, obviously, as a journalist with TechCrunch for 15 years, when we started trying to cover technology startups in Europe, firstly, I was based in London, but I mean, Europe is a lot bigger than London. And I think the other thing was that there was just not enough going on in the UK. So wanted to spread our wings, look at all sorts of other sort of centres across Europe. And so gradually, I hung out in Paris and Berlin and Stockholm and Barcelona. And then about 10 years ago, I realised that also, something was starting to happen here in Lisbon. Obviously, it was still quite early days.
Of course. But you spotted it, right? I mean, you spotted it right at the beginning, because that's more or less when the ecosystem in its current form started, right? The first few great examples, TalkDesk from Christine and a few others, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think also gradually, long before the pandemic, people in tech were started to do remote working. Yeah. And so the combination of having a really nice city to live in, a nice location, and being able to work remotely, I think was attractive to Europeans. You saw it in Barcelona. Yeah. Suddenly lots of Germans and Swiss people and Swedish people turned up. And so that happened. I think the same thing happened in Lisbon. But also each individual city and location across Europe became its own kind of little mini Silicon Valley in a way, especially with investors. And as the early VC scene started to happen in London, same thing happened in Paris, Berlin. You got local VCs, and they would invest in local entrepreneurs. Yeah. So build absolutely
them up until they're ready to go to the big boys, right?
Exactly, yeah. So and I think once you develop that early VC scene, like with you guys, obviously started this firm, and but then you started to get local entrepreneurs, and I think also Lisbon itself is just such a lovely, beautiful city, and you've got access to nature nearby. It just makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's why we're here and don't want to go back to London.
Right.
But so let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Who is Mike Butcher? I mean, everybody knows you're a super well-known, fixture in the tech scene globally. But how did you become, a journalist, and how did you get interested in tech? And, give us a little bit of your story that people don't know normally.
I think, people often think that it just sort of happens overnight, but really, it's a long journey for me to be able to get to this point with working with TechCrunch and being able to, have a fairly high profile voice in the industry. But, I think you've got to start a long time ago, really, because people think that people have just appeared from nowhere, but actually it's all a long journey, isn't it? But I mean, I guess my particular story is that I was a journalist in London in the 90s, and I was working on magazines and newspapers, but I was always the more geeky guy, slightly geeky, fixing everyone's Mac.
Covering tech or at all in regular papers, or not at all?
No, well, actually, I started in local newspapers in Hammersmith in London, and then the internet came along, and I was always the guy who would fix everyone's Mac, and bizarrely, and then I found out about a magazine that was running, writing about the internet industry, and I joined in 1995, and 3 years later I was the editor. And so I went through the .com boom,
right?
And that was called New Media Age magazine, and we wrote about ISPs mostly and websites, and so there was no such thing as like writing about apps. Yeah. You just wrote about websites, and it was more of a media industry in a way, because it was called New Media Age.
Right. That's right. So I was in London at that time, right?
Right, yeah.
Late 90s and then early noughts.
Exactly, yeah. So then obviously the internet boom happened.
First Tuesdays kind of thing.
First Tuesday meetups, yes. I went to a few of those, and so we got a kind of a taste of Silicon Valley and the .com boom with that, and then of course there was a .com bust, and actually, so for a few years between about 2002 and 4 or 5, there wasn't a hell of a lot going on. It was just like the internet is just email and websites.
Yes.
And then, of course, when Web 2 came along, the idea that you could run applications.
Winter, right?
Yeah, the nuclear winter. But when the concept of Web 2 came along, you could run applications over the internet. And then, of course, eventually you had the launch of the iPhone. And then, of course, everything just took off from there. And TechCrunch started in July 2005. And I started working for them as a freelancer in 2006 and came on board in 2007. And so TechCrunch has ridden that wave, that Web 2 wave, all the way up. And then, of course, we started covering Web 3 as well. So it's been a fantastic journey.
Now, you've been covering the industry in Europe, but also globally for the last 20 odd years. We've come a long way, right? In Europe, and obviously led by London, but now many other ecosystems. Even Lisbon now is a mini London in a way. How far are we from the US? I mean, what does it take? Is it possible to actually reach something close to like a US style ecosystem, Silicon Valley style?
Well, I think that if you look at the development of America, they have a 30, 40-year head start on us. You had Fairchild Semiconductors, was one of the first ever technology companies in Silicon Valley in the 1950s. And so they've had a long time to figure this out. But it's the development of venture capital as an equity class that really powered the United States. And that business model for financing high growth businesses and technology businesses, we got that into Europe, 20 or so years ago. And that means that Europe completely has the potential to produce lots of great companies. And we've seen that Spotify, Klarna, big unicorns, and also often, but I think what we produce in Europe generally is not so much consumer technology companies as business and enterprise companies.
We had Farfetch, right, which was a Portuguese-British unicorn, actually, kind of on the consumer, but it's an exception. You're absolutely right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Farfetch actually probably wouldn't have happened in the United States because it's so allied with the fashion industry, which is really largely a European industry. So I think that Farfetch is a fantastic example. But most of the time, a lot of tech companies out of Europe are business. And that's obviously because, the largest single consumer market is the United States. Right. So, and if you want to do consumer startups, it just makes sense to scale in the US. So, we still have the problem of, fractured markets in Europe, different countries, different languages, different cultures, different regulations. We still have that problem. Eventually, somebody in the European Union will figure it out and make it all easier, but for a while it's harder.
Might take a few decades, but don't you think that our issue is mostly capital still? I mean, there's a huge difference in capital, which it doesn't feel like we have a huge difference in tech, right?
No,
we have great engineering, great science, but the capital side, and not only that, you don't have the VCs. That the VCs are much smaller, right? There's no input of capital into the VCs, comparable input of capital.
So I think we've solved the seed stage problem in Europe. We've solved the seed and Series A problem in Europe. We're beginning to solve the Series B to some extent, but you can see what's going on gradually as these funds have become more successful.
They attract more.
They attract more capital. I think right now in 2023 and beyond, we're in a slightly different marketplace. Money is more expensive because of higher interest rates.
A bit harder to raise, of course.
I mean, we are solving that later stage funding problem, that growth funding problem, gradually in Europe. But it doesn't mean I'm not going to be down on the ecosystem. The ecosystem is incredibly, vastly improved on what it was 20 years ago.
All over Europe.
So 100%. So I think it's been, and I think even now, for instance, now you see Eastern European companies coming on stream in the last 10 years. That's going to also be one to watch as well.
Yeah, for sure. East Europe and South Europe kind of woke up
South Europe,
in the last 10 years, right? There was basically nothing, right? And so it's a big... You've also seen different types of entrepreneurs. Do you think that sort of the personality of entrepreneurs changed in the last 20 years? In a sense that people got either more greedy or more ambitious or a mix of both? or not really?
I think they say startups isn't sort of about a place, it's like a state of mind. And what happened is certainly the millennial generation wanted to become, get that kind of Silicon Valley style startup mindset of going a very mission driven, going hard and working very hard. And I think that's totally got, Europe totally got that. And that's happened in the last few years. And now what's happened is that you're now getting serial entrepreneurs. So people who've done a company, exited and maybe took a bit of time off, done some angel investing, and now, boom, they're ready to go again, and they're doing another startup. And I see that now in the last 2, 3, 4 years. You've seen entrepreneurs become second time entrepreneurs, or second, or sometimes even third time. But around about now, you see second time entrepreneurs come in.
But as you said, it takes time, right? Because you're seeing that probably in Berlin, in London, in Stockholm, where things started also earlier. So it's going to take some time for things to happen in that way in Portugal and Spain and Italy and Eastern Europe, because we're still in the first time entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, I would say that would be a fair comment. Yeah, I agree. Probably Spain and Portugal, it's still kind of in that first time entrepreneur phase. But it'll happen probably more rapidly because the access to the ecosystem and the capital is much higher than it was, say, 10 years ago. So I think actually it'll happen probably more rapidly.
What are the things that you find a little bit frustrating still with the European ecosystem? What are things that you think that are kind of hard to sort of solve?
I think, well, that's a very good question. I think that most things are solvable. So you've got access to talent. I think post-pandemic and the acceptance of remote working means that you can hire internationally very easily now. From places like Lisbon, I think, has a lot of advantages because it's such a great place to live and to work that it's quite easier to attract talent here. I think you can solve the talent problem. You can solve the early stage funding problem fairly easily. Sometimes I think there is a little bit of a difference between entrepreneurs sometimes in their sheer hunger. And I don't think it's a European thing. It is about that individual. I can
Is
meet
it a cultural shift? Maybe are people getting? If they have more examples of people that did well, do they also want to do well, or is it a cultural thing? Or an individual thing.
One thing I think there might be a cultural thing is that we should really accept failure. Don't be afraid to get things wrong. A few years ago in Silicon Valley, when I was starting out on TechCrunch, and I used to go to San Francisco quite a lot, you go to a barbecue or something like that, and people would talk about pivoting, and pivoting became a kind of a joke because something had gone wrong. But actually the pivot became good. Yeah. So the more thing. Absolutely. So you would realize that whatever you were doing, the app or the startup wasn't working. You go, we're pivoting to X, Y, and Z. I mean, famously, Instagram started out as a app for ordering drinks or something, didn't it? I can't remember. But it wasn't about photos. And then it kind of pivoted into photos, and bang, now everyone knows about Instagram. So or was it filters? I can't remember what it was. Anyway, but the point is the pivot is not a bad thing. No. So if you're European entrepreneurs, if there's one criticism I'm going to have, I say embrace the pivot. If you know it's going wrong, just say, listen, we're going to change it. Just go for it. Don't so a little bit. It's not a failure because hopefully you're not failing. You're just going in the wrong direction, and now you need to change direction. It's just totally point. Just embrace it.
You see that when people hang on to something forever, with the fear of others thinking it has failed. So they don't change because they sort of stubbornly keep at it. While they should actually say, you know what, not working, move on, let's do something else.
And I think there's American entrepreneurs almost make a virtue of the pivot. They're like, you know what, it's not working. We're going this way. We're relaunching. We're refreshing. We're changing it up, and they're that's one thing they're quite good at, I think.
They're very pragmatic.
Yeah, hugely pragmatic. Yeah,
sometimes a little bit too much for cultural differences.
You know, you can tip over into too pragmatic. Yeah,
but talking about Americans, there's an enormous amount of Americans coming to Lisbon. It's just incredible. I mean, the amount of all sorts of young, middle-aged, and older Americans, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
you go to the US quite a lot, and TechCrunch obviously is a global sort of outlet. And what do you see in terms of the future of America? I'm not saying it's sort of in a grand way, but are there issues that might affect the current political, economic, and even cultural and divisive America that we see? Could this affect maybe the Silicon Valley capacity to produce global category winners?
Well, I think we could sort of make too many generalizations.
Yes.
So it's difficult. I think if you kind of zoom out, America has had quite a convulsive period under Trump, for instance. I think that the dangers in America, the acceptance of handguns and is I think most Americans would accept that there's an issue there. You've had the recession, the pandemic. There's quite a large divide between rich and poor, and I think that so that's become an issue where I think that if you see that it not just about Portugal, but a lot of Americans have spread across the world and also to Europe because they're looking for a new lifestyle. Perhaps that's one aspect. Another aspect is obviously you can do a company almost anywhere from anywhere in the world now, so that you can do that. You don't have to be in the States, and and I think that's probably one aspect of it. I think also in a way Europe is getting its act together. Yeah. The Carbon Reduction Act that the European Union is going to unlock a lot of capital and a lot of innovation in green energy and green approaches to the economy. And oddly enough, I think Europe is starting to deregulate around that idea of powering the green economy and the blue economy, slightly faster than the US in some ways, and so that's going to open up a lot of opportunities, I think. So a lot of American entrepreneurs are recognizing that and seeing Europe as a viable place to do their companies.
For sure, and we're very fortunate we have so many American investors in our funds because they think they finally realize that there's something happening in Europe, and people sometimes joke that we're kind of ahead in regulation, but in some aspects that's good, right? In some aspects that's actually positive. But
also the flip side is that I think having gone through the big SaaS revolution over the last sort of 15 years, we're now going to have a deep tech revolution. And deep tech is very in the DNA of Europe because our universities are internationally renowned. So I think the next 5 years is going to be a lot of deep tech, especially around the green economy, the blue economy. And that's going to be a very quintessential European story, I think.
We have found that in many of our deals that involve deep tech and science, when we're talking about scientists and not so much engineers, the difficulties that we're talking like as if it was 10 years ago with the engineers, right? About venture capital, how to finance, what is this all about? In that sense, I think we're still a bit behind, right? Our deep tech entrepreneurs or scientists, they don't speak the language yet of this type of asset class, right? Of this type of financing. Do you find that also across Europe, or is it just us in the blue fund?
No, I think that's probably probably American investors and entrepreneurs are having the same conversations. Obviously, America is also financing a lot of green economy technologies now, and but I think it's just a cultural thing in the same way that engineers culturally, didn't have a kind of a startup mentality 20 years ago. Now you get engineers coming out of universities. They know all about venture capital a lot of the time and startups and things like that. And I think it'll just be a cultural shift, similarly with the scientific community. And I think it's already happened and is happening. But yeah, we're sort of early days for that. It'll take a while. Yeah.
In addition to being on TechCrunch, you have put together an incredible event, the Europas. Why did you do that, and what is it all about?
So I did the Europas Awards, and I started it 15 years ago as a way to bring together the European technology ecosystem, slightly selfishly, because I wanted to put everyone in one room and
one big party,
have one big party. But as a journalist, because I wanted to make more contacts and network in the industry more easily. But it took on a life of its own, and now it's an annual celebration of startups. But it's also become a great vehicle for entrepreneurs and startups to market what they're doing. So we have quite a long long list of applicants. We have about 25 categories, and we put together a judging panel of about 50 judges from across the European ecosystem. A large majority of them are investors. Yeah. So the investors get to see new companies. The entrepreneurs get in front of investors. And then at the end of the year, we have a great celebration. This year in 2023, November 13th of November in Lisbon, we'll be having a great lunch and a networking in the afternoon and a couple of panel sessions. Really great kind of, great get together. And then in the evening, we'll have a big celebration, a big party. I call it the Eurovision Song Contest for startups for Europe. But
we hope it's better than that.
Maybe less kind of cheesy songs. And,
exactly.
But it's just a great way to get everyone together. So yeah, come along. I hope you will be able to come.
Absolutely, we're always there. When are applications due? What's the process? What do you recommend?
The applications are open right now. Go to theeuropas.com, and and we're also obviously looking for partners, so you can just email hello@theeuropas.com. But hopefully I'll see you there. Thanks very much for Indico for inviting me onto the famous red chair.
We're very happy to have you here. It was great to see you, Mike.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Always welcome. Thank you.